My name is Paul, and as Justin mentioned, I'm an associate professor of biology at Cal Poly Humboldt, where I teach ecology, marine biology, and invertebrate zoology in the Department of Biological Sciences there. And I want to share some of the work that my students and I are doing that involves quite a bit of the Lost Coast and Cape Mendocino. And I just want to introduce myself as an ecologist. By training, that's what I am. I'm an ecologist. And for me, the fundamental goal of ecology is to really understand how organisms interact with their environment. And, just as with all of life, the one constant in an organism's environment is change. And that could be spatial change in physical or biological conditions across local and global environmental gradients, or that could be temporal change in temperature or precipitation associated with seasons. Regardless of the type of change, environmental change is really the norm of nature. And so understanding how organisms respond to environmental change and this fundamental goal of ecology is nothing really new in the field. It's actually been the goal of ecologists for decades. But I feel like today this goal really takes on new meaning and some urgency to focus our efforts on understanding how organisms are going to respond to a rapidly changing global environment brought about by things like the overharvesting of top predators, the introduction of non-native species, disease outbreaks and epidemics, and changing climatic conditions. And so the research that my students and I do really focuses on understanding how individual organisms respond, I should say, to changing environmental conditions, and really what are the ecological consequences of those responses at different levels of organization. So we can think about the environment affecting individuals, but the responses of those individuals has consequences at the population level, which then has consequences for communities and ultimately for whole ecosystems. And so what we do to sort of do this, we really focus on species that have disproportionately large effects on ecosystems or are disproportionately important in determining the structure and function of natural ecological communities. Things like what we call foundation species and keystone species. And so I just want to define what those are to avoid some jargon here. So we can think of foundation species as species that are defined as having really large effects on community structure by modifying environmental conditions, also modifying species interactions and resource availability within their systems just through their physical presence alone. So in marine systems, some of the classic examples of what we think of as foundation species include things like forest-forming kelps, like the bull kelp you see here, which is common along our coast. On the East Coast, and less commonly in California, but still in some places California, things like salt marsh grasses, like we see in Humboldt Bay, for example. Reef-building corals, as other examples. All of these, and for you folks that like to walk in the redwoods, redwood trees are a great example of a foundation species. All of these species share in common this idea that the physical presence of each of these species provides things like food, habitat, and shelter for a diversity of other species in the ecosystems that they inhabit. And so a keystone species is a species that we can think of that also has a disproportionately large impact on the ecosystem, but that effect is really large relative to its abundance. And so a keystone species is sort of analogous to an arch or a keystone in an arch. Basically, this species, just like the keystone supports the arch, the presence of this species supports the whole structure of the ecosystem and prevents it from collapsing. And so keystone species can actually affect communities in a number of different ways. So for example, predatory sea stars that prey on things like sea urchins or sea mussels can prevent the overpopulation of those urchins and mussels, and keep kelp forests and intertidal rocky shores healthy. Beavers are also a great example of ecosystem engineers, or keystone species that actually engineer their ecosystem by building dams that can actually transform the environment that they live in a way that allows certain other species to survive and flourish in those habitats. And we can even think of something like a honeybee as a keystone species, as they pollinate a wide variety of different plant species, ensuring the continuation of those plants' life cycles. Now, as we know, global climate change is affecting these important species. And as a result, the structure and function of ecological communities and the ecosystem services they provide is going to be compromised by the negative consequences of climate change on these important foundation and keystone species. So one of the major environmental changes associated with climate change in the marine realm is ocean acidification. And we can think of ocean acidification where increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide is driving increasing absorption of carbon dioxide by the oceans. And this comes along with a corresponding increase in the carbonic acid in the water. We know that about a third of all of the carbon dioxide released from fossil fuel combustion is actually trapped in the world's oceans. And so if it weren't for the oceans, we'd actually be a whole lot worse off in terms of the effect of fossil fuel combustion on climate change. So the ocean is acting as this nice big absorbent sponge, but this has real consequences for the ocean. And so as carbon dioxide levels continue to increase, they have a direct impact on the acidity of the ocean. And you can see here, this is a graph here showing rising levels of carbon dioxide in red there, and then rising levels of CO2 in the ocean in green that parallels that increase in atmospheric CO2 in red, and then the concomitant decrease in ocean pH in water off the coast of Hawaii. Now, global oceanic pH has actually declined by 0.1 units since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And 0.1 units might not seem like a lot, but pH is measured on a logarithmic scale. And so a change in 0.1 units is actually about a 23 to 24% increase, or decrease, I should say, in pH since that time. So relatively large change. And further forecasts actually predict a further reduction of 0.35 units just by the end of this century, by the end of the 21st century. So this rate of change is actually pretty scary. It's unprecedented in our geologic record. And so you might imagine that such a drastic and rapid change has motivated quite a bit of efforts to understand what the biological implications of ocean acidification might be for marine organisms. And one big potential implication is to calcifying marine organisms. And so those are marine organisms that build their shells or their exoskeletons out of calcium carbonate. And so as I mentioned, as the ocean absorbs carbon dioxide, it creates carbonic acid. And this carbonic acid actually steals carbonate ions out of the ocean from the water that are needed for those calcifying marine organisms to build and maintain their shells. So ocean acidification has potentially really negative consequences for these marine calcifiers. And the acidification of our world's oceans has real consequences. And actually, there's some real consequences that hit pretty close to home here on the West Coast. This is from a recent study that found that ocean acidification is dissolving the shells of baby Dungeness crabs, which, as we all know, is a key commercial and recreational fishery here in the Pacific Northwest. And this is actually just one of hundreds of studies that are documenting these negative effects of ocean acidification on calcifying marine life. So what I'd like to share with you today is just a little bit about how we're using the Lost Coast as part of a natural laboratory for studying how global change affects marine life. And then what we're finding out, and hopefully convince you that not all of what we're finding out is bad news. And there's actually a little bit of optimism here in this neck of the woods regarding the effects of ocean acidification on some of these keystone and foundation species in the marine realm close to home. So one of the things I want to point out is that environmental variability is really an intrinsic characteristic of coastal ecosystems along California. And those of you living here on the coast of California know that very well. And so there's changes in carbon dioxide, ocean pH, temperature, nutrients, and a whole lot of other factors that are the result of these dynamic processes that occur along the coast, such as upwelling. So along the California coast, so deep cold water in the Pacific Ocean normally holds much more carbon dioxide than water near the surface. And fossil fuel emissions are just adding more CO2 to that already carbon dioxide rich water. And then seasonally, wind blowing across the ocean is going to push surface water offshore of California between April and September each year, usually. And what that means is that that deep, cold, carbon dioxide rich water that's below the surface gets drawn up near the coast to replace that wind-blown water. And so in this region, populations of calcifying marine organisms are actually exposed to natural variation in ocean pH and carbon dioxide due to this seasonal upwelling. And like in other coastal regions around the world, the natural variability produced by this intermittent upwelling can produce ocean acidity that's actually far greater in magnitude than what is predicted to change due to ocean acidification by the end of the century. Why that's important is that that may have actually promoted or prompted the evolution of tolerance to low pH or acidic seawater in the marine organisms that have experienced this intermittent upwelling throughout their history. And so really this region actually provides what I think of as this natural laboratory for studying the tolerance of marine calcifying organisms to the potential threat of ocean acidification in the future. And so one of the many things that my students and I, my lab and I have been working on is the tolerance of California mussels to ocean acidification on the north coast of California. And so for those of you who don't know, California mussels are a key foundation species that provide homes for hundreds of other algal and invertebrate species on the coast. And they're a rich food source for species ranging from sea stars even to humans. And we've been working at two locations north of Cape Mendocino and two locations south of the Cape. And the reason that this is important is that south of Cape Mendocino, the acidity of coastal waters, or the pH of coastal waters, rarely falls below 7.75. And I just want to note here that the pH of ambient seawater is typically, it hovers around 8.0. So the water south of Cape Mendocino, the pH never gets too low. In contrast, if you go to the coastal waters north of Cape Mendocino, they experience this recurrent, strong, but highly variable upwelling regime, meaning that the organisms on the coast there get exposed to this deep carbon dioxide rich, low pH water during the upwelling season. So what we can think of as north of Cape Mendocino, there's this ocean acidification hotspot that we like to call it, that imposes more variable and potentially much more stressful low pH acidic water conditions for the mussels. But upwelling also brings nutrients with it up to the coast as well. And so it also allows for higher concentrations of phytoplankton, which are the food for mussels on the coast, to develop near shore. So not only does it bring potentially more stressful conditions to the mussels in terms of lower pH, it also provides them with enhanced environmental opportunity for growth because of the additional food inputs into the system. And so what we've been doing is we've been characterizing the pH variability in the ocean north and south of Cape Mendocino. And we've done this by installing these intertidal pH monitors or sensors that measure pH in the intertidal zone every 15 minutes. You can see one pictured here. This is out on Cape Mendocino. We've also been using some historical data that's been collected by some monitoring networks and some other universities near our study locations that have really shown similar patterns of variation in ocean pH over several years. So I don't want to show too many data graphs in this lecture here, but I did want to show this one here. So on the left, you have intertidal pH. Again, pH is measuring the acidity of the water. And the two bars on the left, the green and the orange bars on the left, represent data that were collected from north of Cape Mendocino. And then the purple and the magenta bars on the right represent data that was collected south of Cape Mendocino. And what you should be able to see there is that there's much greater variability in ocean pH north of the Cape than there is south of the Cape. And then just on the right-hand side, this is data that's taken from a sensor installed on the pier at Trinidad Head. This is Humboldt State University data showing consistently high levels of pH variation from year to year. You can see that the ocean pH off of Trinidad Head there ranges from 8.4 all the way down to as low as 7.2, which again is as low as what we're predicting for global oceans under ocean acidification by the end of this century. So we have this really high variability in ocean pH north of Cape Mendocino, less so south of the Cape. And then just here on the right-hand side, these are the sensors that we've installed. On the left-hand side is the sensor in Trinidad in orange. On the right-hand side of the top right upper graph in purple is the sensor we installed in Cape Mendocino. And again, what you can see is that the variation in the pH of the ocean water is more than twice as variable in Trinidad than it is on Cape Mendocino. So much more variable north of the Cape than south of the Cape. My students and I have also collected weekly samples of ocean water at these different locations north and south of the Cape. And we can analyze chlorophyll A. And what chlorophyll A tells us about is the amount of phytoplankton that's in the water. And that's important because phytoplankton is what mussels feed on. And what I want you to see here is that food for mussels is generally much higher north of the Cape than it is south of the Cape. So we have strong variation in exposure to upwelling events north and south of Cape Mendocino, resulting in really consistent site-to-site differences in ocean pH and food available for the mussels as well. And so what we wanted to know is, how is this variation affecting the mussels that live on the shore in these different locations? And so we did a field experiment, a pretty extensive field experiment at these 4 different locations, where we measured the growth of over 200 mussels, small mussels, at each of these 4 source locations. And this is actually not as hard as it might seem. This can be done by marking each mussel with a spot of colored nail polish and some clear coat that you see here on the left. And then you can file a small triangular notch into the lip of the mussel. I'm hoping you can see that there on the slide as well. And then what you can do is you can come back in several weeks or even months later, and you can measure the growth of the mussel relative to that notch that we carve into the mussel initially. And this is something that I wasn't sure was going to work, but we did a pretty decent job. We actually recovered about 50% to 60% of the marked mussels in the field after we let them grow out there for a few months. And what I want to show you here is that we found that those mussels north of Cape Mendocino grew about 35% faster than those mussels from locations south of Cape Mendocino. And so in a way, was a surprising result. Off the waters of California, as they become more acidic, some scientists have actually found, and mainly in Southern California, that California mussel shells have been weakening over time, presumably due to increasingly acidic oceans. And so what we actually expected to find was that mussels from these OA hotspots north of Cape Mendocino should be doing poorly under these highly variable and much more acidic conditions than south of the Cape. And they should be growing less and having weaker shells than mussels from outside those hotspots south of Cape Mendocino. But instead, what we found is that the mussels from those ocean acidification hotspots are actually growing more. And they also, I didn't show the data here, but they also have thicker shells than the mussels from outside the OA hotspots south of the Cape. So they're actually doing better. And the idea here is that presumably because these mussels have much more abundant food north of Cape Mendocino, that is allowing them to be more resistant to exposure to these low pH conditions that they get during seasonal upwelling. Okay, so I want to switch gears here a little bit from mussels to sea stars. And a sea star is not usually the first example that comes to mind when you're picturing a voracious and fearsome top predator. But however, many sea stars, that's exactly what they are. They're awesome top predators in the ecosystems that they inhabit. And in many cases, particularly in nearshore coastal zones, many sea stars are these keystone species that have major impacts on the diversity and the functioning of their ecosystems. And so the most well-known keystone sea star is actually a sea star that's common to the north coast of California, including the Lost Coast, and that's the ochre sea star. That's the purple, orange, and mostly brown sea stars that you see in the intertidal, the rocky intertidal zone in Humboldt and Mendocino County, resident locally here. And we know from some sort of historically groundbreaking experiments that were done back in the 60s that if you remove these ochre sea stars from their coastal intertidal habitat, it allows mussel populations to quickly cover these rocky habitats. And the mussels in turn prevent other species from establishing themselves. So a sea star, a population of sea stars has really important indirect impacts on the many species that inhabit the rocky intertidal zone by removing clumps of mussels, thereby allowing other species to come into the system. So when sea stars are present, you have a much more diverse ecosystem than when the sea stars are absent. So because of their importance, their ecological importance, many scientists really became quickly alarmed when these top predators began disappearing a few years ago. And so you might remember from back in 2013, millions of sea stars have basically wasted away into slime and piles of ossicles and goo, like you see here in this picture, due to a disease known as sea star wasting disease. And this is sort of a real nasty, grisly disease where symptoms start with these white lesions on the sea star, leading to a deflated body, slackening heartbeat, the arms start to fall off of the sea star, the organs start to rupture, and then eventually they end up dead in this sort of pile of goo. And so this is a photo of an ochre sea star here that has succumbed to the disease. And so back in 2013, sea stars started dying off in droves, including here on the Lost Coast and in Humboldt County. And while this disease has been seen in the past, it's never caused deaths so quickly or occurred at such a large scale or for as long as we saw between 2013 and 2015. And during this time, more than 20 species of sea stars from Mexico all the way up to Alaska were severely impacted. And the sunflower sea star, which is another sea star that we used to see pretty commonly locally here, was particularly susceptible to this disease, and we lost about 80 to 100% of local populations along the entire 3,000 kilometer range that the sunflower star inhabits. So given the importance that sea stars have on their ecosystems, my lab, along with many others along the West Coast, really wondered what the future of the intertidal might look like without ochre sea stars. Remember the important impacts that ochre sea stars have on the intertidal ecosystem. By keeping mussel populations in check, they will allow lots of other organisms to come in and inhabit the rocky intertidal shoreline, increasing the diversity of the system. So without the sea stars around to keep the mussels in check, we could almost envision a future of an intertidal much less diverse and sort of dominated by mussels. And so following the major wipeout of this particular species from wasting disease in 2013, we wondered whether or not there might be any other predators in the system that could potentially step up to take over the major role as keystone predator in the absence of the ochre sea star. And what we found is that the answer on rocky shores, at least here in Northern California, could be yes. In fact, we found that rock crabs, which inhabit the same rocky intertidal zone as sea stars, are also major predators of sea mussels. And so we did this experiment actually out on Cape Mendocino at this place we call Mussel Rock because of the abundance of mussels there. What we did is we removed the few remaining sea stars that were left. And I can tell you in 2014 and 15, when we did this, there weren't many sea stars left there. And we looked at the mortality of these California mussels in caged and uncaged plots on the shore. And we found that the survivorship of mussels in low tide zones that are frequented by crabs was significantly greater in cages. So the mussels that were in cages and protected from crabs survived quite well on the low shore, even though we don't commonly encounter them there. And the mussels that we had transplanted down to the low shore but didn't cage were quickly eaten up by crabs. And so the health of the ecosystem, even in the absence of the ochre sea stars, at least on Cape Mendocino, might be kept intact by predation by this other predator that often doesn't get the same type of notice as an important keystone predator in the intertidal. So we like to think of the Cape Mendocino shore as having this built-in functional redundancy, this sort of backup predator that can also keep the mussels at bay. The good news is that ochre sea stars seem to be recovering along with some resistance to the deadly disease. But even though they're recovering in many parts of their range, really more time is needed before these populations are probably able to resume their role as keystone predators in their ecosystems. Okay, so I just want to switch gears one last time. We're going to go from sea stars now to kelp. And as some of you may know, bull kelp forests are one of the foundations of our nearshore coastal ecosystems along the northern coast of California. And the floating canopy of this kelp here that you see in this picture provides shelter for young fish. And the kelp itself provides food for lots of very valuable species, such as things like red abalone and red sea urchin. But another thing that we've really been interested in is whether or not bull kelp may actually help alleviate stress from ocean acidification on other species that exist within it or nearby it. So there's been really widespread speculation that submerged aquatic vegetation like kelp might protect coastal organisms and the ecosystems they inhabit by helping to alleviate the stress of low pH conditions associated with ocean acidification. And the reason for this is because aquatic plants and algae photosynthesize, right? And as they photosynthesize, what they're doing is they're removing carbon dioxide from the seawater. And what this does is decreases acidity, increases oxygen, and also increases calcium carbonate, all three of those things which can help marine organisms build and maintain their shells. And so with all the talk about marine macrophytes like kelps and kelp forests protecting coastal environment from ocean acidification, we wanted to know under what circumstances is that true and to what extent. And so what we did is we went out into some local kelp forests, both north and south of Cape Mendocino. So we looked at some kelp forests in Trinidad Harbor. And then we also looked at some kelp forests near Portuguese Beach in Mendocino County. Oops, sorry about that. And what we did is we went out and we installed these sensor arrays, much like the arrays that we installed in the intertidal zone earlier in the talk, inside and outside of the kelp, at the top and at the bottom of the kelp, to measure how acidic and how oxygenated the water was in these different locations throughout the kelp growing season, with the intent of finding out if the kelp, through the process of photosynthesis, could actually change the chemistry of the seawater around it. And what we found is that near the ocean surface, the seawater was much less acidic in the kelp than outside of the kelp during the day when the kelp is photosynthesizing, suggesting that the kelp canopy can actually reduce the acidity of the seawater during the day. And so what this suggests is that kelp could actually mitigate some of the stress of ocean acidification and kind of serve as an ocean acidification oasis for canopy-dwelling organisms like sea urchin larvae, juvenile rockfish, and other calcifying organisms that inhabit the canopy of the kelp forest. What we did find also, though, is that the effects didn't extend all the way down to the ocean floor. Much of the photosynthesis, as you might imagine, of the kelp happens in the canopy up near the surface. So we didn't see the effects at the bottom. And we only saw the effects during the day when photosynthesis is actively happening. And we also only saw those effects during the kelp growing season. So there are some potential limits to the benefits from kelp, but we do suggest that kelp might be this sort of haven from the stress of ocean acidification during certain times of the year and also during certain times of the day for some of these marine organisms that inhabit the kelp forest. So we're excited to continue this work going forward. And there's some urgency to this because it could provide yet another reason to help protect kelp. As you may know, our kelp forests are in serious trouble in California. They've decreased by up to about 93%, decreased up to about 93% of what's normal in the past 5 years. And so higher sea surface temperatures in recent years have limited kelp growth. Sea star wasting disease has wiped out the sunflower star that I mentioned earlier. That's important because that sunflower star is a key predator of purple urchins. And that's led to historical outbreaks of purple urchins that have led to further declines in California kelp forests. And the effects of the kelp forests really sort of reach from the ocean to the shore, right? So we know that the red abalone fishery has been closed down for several years now because the abalone have been severely impacted by the lack of food due to the lack of kelp. Fewer fish, rockfish in particular, has meant fewer or less amount of food for things like shorebirds and marine mammals, like harbor seals and sea lions. And so my lab and others at Cal Poly Humboldt are continuing to monitor the situation with kelp declines and rebounds as well on the North Coast. So with that, I'd like to just say thanks to all my collaborators and colleagues and support. I would especially like to acknowledge the help of all my undergraduates at Humboldt State or Cal Poly Humboldt now, and my funding and support. And I just want to thank you all for being here and for listening attentively during my talk, and happy to take any questions you might have.
All right, thank you, Paul. That was great. And so yeah, folks, we're going to change the security settings here to allow people to unmute themselves. And so anybody who has a question, we'd love to hear from you. I guess one question I had as I was listening to things, I was wondering, as you look throughout California, particularly as it relates to mussels and I'm wondering in areas with lower pH and other areas of California where you see less upwelling and food, are you seeing different results in terms of the health of the mussel populations in places like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really seems like food is the key. And this idea that mussels have experienced these sort of variable nearshore conditions throughout their evolutionary history. And so we think they're pretty well adapted to these fluctuations in pH. And so long as they have abundant food, they do pretty well in resisting those stressors. If food is scarce and less abundant, that's when we start to see the effects of the low pH on the mussels and their growth and their shell strength.
Gotcha. So we got a question from Max Gordon, who's joining us from Washington State, and he says, what role does BOEM play in your research?
No, I'm horrible with acronyms, so I'm going to need for you to tell me what that acronym is.
Okay. Well, in the meantime, we will see if anybody else has some questions. Everybody can turn on their video now and chime in with their audio if they want to ask directly, or put it in the chat, and we'll address your question that way. So Max, if you're out there, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, one of the logos on the slides.
Great. So that organization was involved in some of the ocean pH monitoring that was done, not by my lab, but for some of the historical data that was collected on ocean pH.
Great. And it looks like we got a question. Andy, you got a question?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I'm just, I'm curious, the studies show a lot of great potential for knowledge and applying that knowledge to improve habitats and species. Also, some of the stats you quoted, like 95% reduction in kelp and die off of all the stars and everything, were pretty disconcerting. And I just wonder how, in your own mind and heart and your outlook, you balance the promise you see in your studies and also the challenges to the environment you see in the larger picture of things.
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question, and that's a tough struggle every day, to be honest. It's sometimes hard to maintain optimism. I guess what I do as a scientist, at least currently and recently, is sort of point out these potential issues or consequences of climate change, but I'm not necessarily doing anything with my research to help solve the problem, as I am more just pointing out potential issues. None of this goes away unless we stop burning fossil fuels, and until that changes, it's kind of hard to maintain optimism for some of these problems that are going on. But I will say that the one thing that has come out of this research that has surprised me and that does give me some optimism is the resilience of these organisms and these systems. Right, the mussels have adapted to these highly variable conditions, and it seems like they might not be as bad off as we originally thought. The sea stars are starting to come back. At one of the sites up in Crescent City in 2014, the sea stars there were almost absent. And we have 4 times as many sea stars there now as we did a few years back. And those sea stars seem to be much more resistant to the disease now than they were. And even here in Trinidad, the study that we did on the kelp forest in Trinidad Harbor, my poor graduate student had this great study planned and got out to where the kelp bed was in June, and it was gone. And she thought she didn't have a project to do. And then a few months later, it showed up, and it's been there ever since. And we know that some of the kelp forests are actually returning to healthy states. So I think nature is resilient. I think we have to worry more about our future than the rest of the natural world's future. I think nature will find a way to adapt and evolve. but I think it would be good for us to stop making it so hard on them to do so.
Thank you.
All right, so looks like Lindsay, you might have your mic off. Do you have a question? Or on, rather, your mic is on.
I did have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I'm just curious about a very small factoid. I heard several years ago that Tomales Bay, down in Point Reyes, where there was a great controversy about oysters, where a lot of oyster spat were raised, was having trouble raising its spat because of the acidification of that particular area. And that as a result, a lot of oyster spat were being raised here in Humboldt Bay. Is that true?
The
Is-
only
are
part I
there
can
that-
speak to there is oyster spat and oyster larvae are particularly vulnerable and susceptible to acidic waters. And so in places where the water is highly acidic, those little baby oysters don't do too well. I don't know if any of those operations were moved to Humboldt as a result of that. That's not something I'm familiar with. It would be interesting if that were the case. Humboldt Bay, at least relative to the coastal waters here, is much more stable in terms of its pH regime. So you don't get those large fluctuations in the bay as you do on the outer coast. So it's a bit more hospitable than the outer coast, but I don't know how it is in relation to Tomales Bay.
Just to chime in a little bit, I remember a few years ago at the Oyster Festival, there was some publicity and, celebration of Humboldt Bay oysters, of course. And one factoid that I remember, and of course my memory is as foggy as it can possibly be, but one thing that I remember was they said that Humboldt Bay is one of the major sources for oyster embryo on the West Coast. So
Yeah,
fact check me, but I think that's what I remember.
Yeah, I do know that several of the oyster growers here do provide spat and seed to other growers on the West Coast. Yeah, and that may be in part due to the conditions here.
The best news is the variability in conditions north and south of the Great Divide.
Yeah, well, and that could change though, unfortunately. That's how it is now, and it's been how it's been historically. There are some warning signs that south of the Cape, things are getting a bit more acidic. And without the food, especially for the mussels, that may be bad news for those mussels there.
All right, it looks like Dawn has her hand up, and then maybe Marcia after that. Go ahead, Dawn.
I think you're muted.
Dawn, you're up. There you go. Maybe not. Marcia, I see you turned your mic on. Did you have a question?
Yes, I'm wondering about sea level rise. Maybe you covered it before I joined. Does that dilute the acidification?
No, it wouldn't necessarily. I don't myself study sea level rise, although I'll give a shout out to Lori Richmond at Cal Poly Humboldt, who is sort of leading the charge on looking at the potential impacts of sea level rise in Humboldt County. No, that same acidic water in the ocean now is going to be the same acidic water that rises further onshore. So if there is some sort of interaction with fresh water, then that could certainly change the acidity of the water, but it won't be diluted by rising per se.
And if the sea rises the way they've said 8 inches by 2050,
Right.
does that mean that more rocks would possibly be uncovered, or will mussel beds drown?
The mussels themselves won't drown. They'll do okay because they would prefer to be underwater. The mussel beds will probably shift upward on the shore, because as long as there's healthy sea stars and crabs, the lower edge of the mussel bed is going to be kind of kept in check by those predators. So down below the water, the mussels get picked off pretty easily by the sea stars and the crabs. As the water gets higher, that means the lower edge of the bed is going to start shifting up the shore. So that's what we would predict for the mussels, is they would get higher on the shore as the sea level rises.
And one last question. There seems to be an invasion of jellies right now. What is their role?
That's a great question. Depending on who you talk to, there are some marine biologists that predict that under these sort of, so the ocean's not just getting more acidic, it's also getting warmer, right? And jellies tend to do well in warm, acidic water. And so part of the reason that we may see more and more jellies is because they do particularly well under those conditions. And that's bad because jellyfish will compete for some of the same resources that juvenile fish do. And so they could compete with ecologically and also economically important fish species in the future as they get more abundant.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. It looks like Dawn, she was having issues getting her mic turned on, but I made her a co-host here. So let's see if that changes anything. Otherwise, Dawn, maybe type your question into the chat if it still doesn't let you ask your question with video on and audio. In the meantime, if there are other questions that folks have, please feel free to chime in and turn your mic off and video on if you want, and let us know.
I think I got it to work.
Hey,
Paul.
There you are.
That's an awesome talk. Thanks so much. I really appreciated the sort of entire perspective you gave today. You know, the ocean's a big place, and ocean acidification is a big problem. And you were saying that how resilient these marine organisms are to that, and some are more so and some are less so. In terms of any management decisions or management choices, do you know, or what are what's the outlook for management of these areas in relation to such a massive problem that we can't really grapple with?
Yeah, I really, you know, we as scientists so often talk about, you know, how our results might have some implications for management, but you know, as you mentioned, this is a gigantic ocean-wide problem, right? Yeah. So how do you manage something like that? Locally in California, this idea that marine macrophytes might provide some refuge for important calcifying organisms has been thrown out as a potential management idea. Like, let's restore kelp forests, let's restore seagrass habitats, let's restore some of these marine macrophytes so that we can create more amenable habitats to these calcifying organisms. But that approach has been questioned. Just the logistics of that is really difficult. And the benefits that they provide, while they are real, I think are somewhat limited. And I really think the only management strategy here is to stop burning fossil fuels and stop pumping CO2 in the atmosphere. You know, I don't think, you know, it's prevention rather than triage, I think, is the way to go.
Yeah. My understanding is that, you know, ocean acidification, like once it starts to ramp up, is kind of hard to turn this very big ship.
There's a lot of inertia. Yeah.
Yeah. And where are we on that trajectory? Are we, like, we talk about these, you know, global climate change of 1 centimeter is the sort of threshold. I mean, I don't know what the threshold is for ocean acidification.
We're kind of right at that tipping point where we really need to start making changes, or it's not going to be easily turned back.
On behalf of Friends of the Lost Coast and the Bureau of Land Management King Range National Conservation Area, thank you for tuning in to Lost Coast Lectures. To view the complete archive of recordings from this series, or to learn more about our work inspiring a passion for nature, visit Friends of the Lost Coast online at lostcoast.org.